You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.
So welcome back to this session with myself, Owen Walker. So in this episode, we're going to explore the emotional debrief with Aggie Rice. So what we wanted to do is look at the concept and tool of Schwartz Rounds and Aggie's journey of implementation of Schwartz Rounds within the NHS. So Schwartz Rounds can be described as a structured forum where all staff, clinical and non-clinical, come together to regularly discuss the emotional and social aspects of working in healthcare. So in this session, we wanted to explore the purpose of Schwartz Rounds and some of the potential benefits to the staff that participate in them. We also wanted to look at the evidence and staff feedback as to the utility and ability to flatten the hierarchies of management within an organisation. So the underlying premise of Rounds is that the compassion shown by staff can make all the difference to patient care, but also in turn, staff can feel supported in their work as a result. So we wanted to dig into this principle and get the thoughts from Aggie, who is implementing them at both local and national level. So Aggie Rice is a mentor and trainer for Schwartz Rounds and Team Time programs. And after working for the Point of Care Foundation for a few years and as an associate, Aggie joined the foundation in this full-time role in 2021. Aggie has worked on Schwartz Round programs since 2016 and has a keen interest in organisational culture, storytelling and the emotional well-being of health and social care staff. So welcome to this session, Aggie.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
It's lovely to have you on. Maybe we could just start by getting you to speak to why Schwartz Rounds are important at a time such as this within healthcare.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think from my perspective, I think Schwartz Rounds are helpful at any time. I mean, I kind of feel quite strongly that actually it feels really important for them to exist and be present in like healthcare organisations, even if every member of staff is flourishing and feeling really good. You know, it feels like there's something really important about just having a space for people to come together and reflect on what it feels like to do the work that they do. So to caveat, I think they should exist in whatever context we're living in or working in. But I do think there is something particularly notable about this time. You know, as we were recording this, there's been lots of strikes and industrial action. And I feel one of the things that Schwartz Rounds are able to do quite meaningfully, in my opinion, is allow an organisation to kind of really kind of meaningfully say that we value you, we care for you, we acknowledge that this work is difficult and we want to kind of provide some space for that to be acknowledged. So there's something about this time in particular where staff, I think, are feeling kind of, you know, really undervalued, that this space to come together and connect to why they do the work and what it feels like. It feels really important. And I'm particularly struck as well by kind of the last few years, how much moral injury has come up for staff, how much people are feeling like they're not working in the way that they feel is important and feels, you know, connected to their values and why they came into it in the first place. So having a space to kind of come together and share stories, to acknowledge that actually they're doing the best that they can in the context that they're in, feels really crucial. One, for them to even feel able to keep going, but two, to also feel less alone and less isolated in those feelings. So I think it feels particularly powerful in terms of sharing stories and listening to stories together, the impact of that being able to kind of change people's narratives so they move from feeling shame and disgust, guilt, loneliness about the work that they feel like they're not doing because of the context that's kind of falling around them. That moves into this one of like self-compassion and shared understanding and kind of shared connection, which feels really important, particularly in terms of staff feeling unable to carry on doing the work and leaving.
So you speak of this, the power of narrative and shared experience. Could you maybe just unpack that a little bit more? Because I'm a fundamental believer in the power of storytelling and narrative and actually mutual identification of, yeah, that was difficult for me, or I really identify with that. Could you maybe speak to that in practice, how you've seen it play out in practice?
Sure. And it feels like quite a big thing to try and capture, really, like to be able to articulate why it feels so important to have space in healthcare to share stories and the power of that storytelling. But I can definitely speak to it in terms of why it feels particularly important for me and what I've seen. And I think one of the big things for me is I'm really struck by the kind of the paradigms that we're presented with in medical education or training programs for being in kind of healthcare, and how much certainty and the right answer or the right way of doing things is kind of held in very high regard and seen as very clear and explicit. And actually what we know when we start going into these roles is that actually most of the time things feel very complex, things feel very uncertain. And so we kind of go into the work thinking that we're going to be these kind of holders of the right answer and the problem solvers who are able to fix things. And actually what we often notice is that we feel like we can't. And consistently, I think for healthcare staff, that is then internalized as something that they're deficient in or they haven't succeeded in. And actually in kind of having space to tell stories and to have kind of narrative that isn't just right or wrong, black and white information, but actually allows the world to exist in its contradictions and its complexities and its uncertainties. It then, for healthcare staff, that then helps again to move away from this narrative of like, oh, I've failed in some way because I haven't been able to solve this situation here. And in kind of sharing that together, as you say, these people are able to move from a position of isolation to shared understanding and to also feel able to gain insight into each other's worlds, into their own work and how they fit into it. And you move from this position of like self-punishment to actually like, okay, cool, I'm doing good enough here. I'm doing what I'm able to do in the complexity and uncertainty of the situation that I'm working in. And so that kind of power of narrative to encompass the complexity of the world, I think just has a huge impact on how we move through it. And that feels important when it feels hard to move through the world as a healthcare staff worker.
So Aggie, you make a really good point there, just around offsetting or mitigating the immediate effects of maybe an illness or disease. But actually, you're right, it's so difficult to address the larger or wider biopsychosocial needs of a patient. And sometimes you don't feel like you get there at all, or indeed offset them at all. And it's just offsetting or delaying or placemaking a situation, and maybe that's all you can ever do. And like you said, maybe that's a revelation. We achieved as much as we ever could in that fraction of time, because a lot of problems, like you said, deep seated over time, have manifested over time, and actually are never going to be solved within the moment, and never going to be solved within a 909 call, or indeed an admission to hospital. And it's potentially almost that realization and revelation, which can be hopefully liberating, especially in very visceral, very emotive situations, and certainly in situations which healthcare staff can really identify things either within their own life, as in acute injury to children, they can relay that to their own children, or indeed just circumstances which they can relate to. And as our good friend Carl Betts says, if the emotional filing cabinet, and if that's not necessarily stored away in the right place and contextualized within a wider narrative, it's really hard to sort of process that. Yeah. Could you maybe speak to how these Schwartz Rounds look? Because in order to dissect the narrative, would I share first? Would you share? How would it look from a leading and or indeed orchestrating a Schwartz Round? How would sort of that look and feel?
Yeah, so sure. I was really struck what you just said there, actually, in terms of that last bit about storytelling being able to bring people together and make them feel more connected and make meaning of the work that they're doing and make meaning of the way that they're kind of sitting within the work. And I'm particularly struck with pre-hospital care and ambulance services, actually, how almost literally isolated you are often. And actually that kind of feeling of storytelling being able to bring connection and insight to kind of one another, that feels like a very powerful thing, again, and something that can feel so kind of isolated and lonely sometimes. But yeah, so I think, so in the Schwartz Rounds, it's quite hard to describe them because I try and move away from these words like intervention or tool, because you kind of want, or certainly I feel like I want them to be seen as this this kind of organic being that always sits within an organization, is always there, will always be sustained, will always be part of the fabric of an organization, rather than something that kind of is brought in and then maybe leaves again. So there, an intervention with a kind of caveat around that word of a monthly forum that sits in an organization and that is facilitated by people from within the organization, where each month people come together, either in a physical space if that suits, or now a lot of people are doing it virtually, particularly for things like peripatetic services like ambulance services and stuff, where each month there will be a different theme. So it might be that the discussion for one month is a patient I'll never forget, or it may be being thrown in at the deep end, or it may be the day I nearly walked out, or the power of a thank you, or it can be whatever feels particularly prevalent in terms of the narratives that are existing in that organization at the time, what people are really feeling, the emotional impact of staff shortages, that kind of thing. So each month we'll have a particular theme, and that there will be some preparation that happens before the Schwartz round. And this kind of connects to this thing that we'll talk about a little bit in terms of psychological safety. There's this preparation that the facilitators do in the lead up to the Schwartz round, where they prepare 3 people to tell their stories based on that theme. So 3 people from the organisation will have volunteered to start off the discussions by speaking for 5 minutes each on their own story of a patient I'll never forget, being thrown in at the deep end the day I nearly walked out. And the facilitators will help in preparation to help the healthcare staff start to talk from their own perspective, because often that takes a bit of practice. Schwartz Rounds are a really big practice for the organisation, for the individuals, for everyone involved. So there's this kind of practice that happens to help the staff be able to kind of almost resituate themselves in the story, because so often when we're caring for patients, we almost remove ourselves from the narrative. We stop going to the toilet, we stop getting the food and water, all that kind of stuff. We start to remove our bodies and remove ourselves. So there's this kind of practice in prepping for stories where you start to resituate yourself at the center of the narrative and talk about, okay, what did this mean for me, this experience? And so the facilitator helps to help that person to get to that, to honing that story. So by the time that the Schwartz round happens, you don't know what the kind of discussion is going to come up from the audience, but you can really have a really kind of good idea of the kind of themes that are coming up. Themes of guilt, themes of isolation, themes of loneliness, themes of feeling powerless, themes of feeling helpless, or, joy, pride, anything that comes with doing the work that we do. And so on the day, the facilitators will open and they'll kind of talk about what Schwartz rounds are and go through the ground rules, and then they'll hand over to the 3 storytellers who will tell their stories for 5 minutes each, uninterrupted. And then the facilitators then open up the discussion to the audience. And again, this is when you start to see the things that we've talked about in terms of kind of moving away from narratives of moral injury and feeling less isolated. People start to say, I was really struck when you talked about feeling really powerless in that moment. I didn't realize that you felt like that. And it feels very comforting to be able to hear that you, as someone that always looks incredibly effective and in control, also feels those things as we do this work. And so you start to feel this thing that happens in the room of people starting to kind of relax, stop holding such high standards for themselves, start connecting to one another and feeling much closer to one another, start seeing each other's worlds and being more compassionate and empathetic towards that and towards themselves. And it really is kind of quite palpable thing that happens in that hour where you start to feel this all happening in the room. And then, as the hour draws to a close, you kind of notice these things happening in the hour. And then the hour starts to draw to a close and the facilitators hand back to the storytellers to offer the final reflections. And you really notice, even though people are being invited to discuss things that may feel difficult or stressing, being able to come together and talk about it, share in it and feel connected in it, leaves people feeling quite uplifted, actually. So it's a really interesting dynamic to see that happens in that whole hour. And that's the kind of anatomy. And then ideally that happens every month in the organisation, so that the staff really feel like this is something that if they can't get to one month, because obviously a lot of staff can't get to an hour every month, it's there and it's going to exist and it's going to persist as it goes along.
Okay, that's fascinating for a number of reasons, really. One is the fact that people feel or the appearance of, sort of psychological safety, really. So there is this almost air of vulnerability, so people can share, and it's sort of welcomed by these three narratives, which are constructed in an organic fashion from the leaders. But it sounds like there's a real air of psychological safety, which hopefully breeds that vulnerable narrative back from other people. Could you maybe speak to, because we've spoken before that it really isn't an analog or indeed a substitute for counselling, and shouldn't really be used as such. Could you maybe just sort of parse those apart and maybe just define why it's not a surrogate for counselling?
Yes, and I think it's important to say that Schwartz Rounds shouldn't be a surrogate for any other kind of forum for reflective practice. There's a really kind of like important need for all these different things that are offered. The thing that feels particularly relevant to that question, I think, with Schwartz Rounds is that Schwartz Rounds are a cultural intervention. They're kind of they're organizational in their, in what they are. They're not just there to improve the psychological well-being of the staff within it, even though that is a huge part of what they do and a really, really important part of the kind of intention of Schwartz Rounds. They're also there to fundamentally shift culture in the organization. So what counselling is very valuable in terms of the kind of one-to-one exchange that is had, whereas there's something about the kind of the whole here, the togetherness of staff coming together. One of the really, really important things that happens as a Schwartz Round is just hearing from one another and realising that actually what may have been us pathologizing something is actually us normalizing something and saying, this is a really normal reaction to the work that we do. This is not something that I need to fix in myself. This is something that needs to be fixed systemically by the kind of way in which we approach this work and the way in which it's held. So there's something about Schwartz Rounds that being there to almost be a counsel to the organizational culture or the systemic culture rather than the individual. So you kind of notice in Schwartz Rounds that they kind of move in and out of meaning for the individual, meaning for the organization, meaning for the individual, and it's working on both levels. So that the whole idea of Schwartz Rounds is that we have very normal reactions to things based on what we're seeing and what we're encountering every day. And actually what the intention is to be able to say, it is very normal to feel incredibly distressed by something like that. Or it's very normal to be consistently burnt out if that's what you're experiencing every day, that level of attrition and distress, rather than, I'm being a bit reductive here about what counselling is. So I'm not trying to say that counselling isn't extremely valuable, because it is, but it's the kind of systemic organizational versus the individual. And Schwartz Rounds are trying to suggest that actually this isn't about individuals. This is about a kind of wider thing, with the individuals being the meaningful parts within that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely does, actually. And it also makes sense from a shared narrative perspective, because I think there's a lot of identification when the barriers come down, and it very succinctly different to counselling, where it's a single narrative, single listener, and actually this really is a shared narrative and designed to really be shared amongst people in quite a different way, but also in a way which has got this air of vulnerability. And I guess my joining question to that, Aggie, might be, how do you navigate sessions where there isn't necessarily that vulnerability, or indeed it's hard? So our good friend Carl is embedding Schwartz Rounds in Yorkshire, and Yorkshire people could be very stoic, very tight-lipped sometimes. Just get on with the job and just power through. But how do you break down these barriers of vulnerability and breed psychological safety if there isn't that in the room, if people really aren't engaging with that?
Yes, and there's something, again, this word that I keep coming back to, which is the word practice and pace. So talking in this way is so countercultural, isn't it? And again, at varying levels, depending on what kind of organization you're in. A hospice compared to an ambulance service is going to feel slightly different in that respect. But there's something about the practice So not assuming that the first Schwartz round that you host is going to involve everyone being like completely open and completely vulnerable. That is unrealistic, and also not a very effective way of going about it. There's something about this gentle practice where the more that Schwartz rounds are embedded in the organization, the more that people will start to edge closer and closer to feeling more able to be openly vulnerable. Because, this is what we're trying to kind of reverse in quite a small way that Schwartz rounds can. 400 years of, the medical, and health culture trying to really, really eradicate any demonstration of emotional vulnerability. So it's not going to happen overnight. So for organizations where it feels even more countercultural, there's something about being able to sit with this and its slow pace. And it's not going to be this kind of really speedy improvement program that's going to switch something around and you're going to be seeing the impact of it within a few months. There's something, and I always find this very comforting, but I know that that's me sitting outside of the health service. So I'm mindful of that. But I find the idea of embedding something that is engendering this slow pace very comforting. That actually this is going to be slow, but it will be meaningful, and meet people where they are. Don't push them. But again, that's why the model is why it is. That's why the storytellers are such an important part of the Schwartz Round model, because you're already, one, in the preparation with the storytellers as a facilitator, making them feel safe, meeting them where they are, resonating with them, relating with their story already. So by the time that they go and tell it in the Schwartz Round, they already feel safer because you've been engendering that as a facilitator in the preparation the whole time. You've been allowing it, you've been giving permission for it. So by the time that they come and tell it in the room, and again, there's always a moment for a storyteller in that moment when they're looking out into the room, and then suddenly they feel like, oh no, I can't do this at all. But then gradually they kind of give themselves permission and the room gives permission, and then it just starts to ripple through. And there will be some people that will take longer than others. And some people, like Carl, who are really able to kind of, as he, in his own words, be the first foot on the dance floor, which is very powerful. But I think there's also something, and we've talked about this before, about one of my favorite things about working with Schwartz Rounds and working with different organizations and different people is that my assumptions are always challenged. I will always hold an assumption about someone not going to be able to, be emotionally articulate and not going to be able to open up, or an organization that won't be able to do it. And I'm always challenged by that. So there is also something about remembering that actually this whole thing is not that deep, it's just getting humans in a room together to be human together. That's all it is. And once you kind of demystify it, it feels much easier, I think. You realize you're actually not asking too much of people. One, it's voluntary, but two, also it's just about saying, yeah, me too. I get that. So there's something about kind of demystifying, I think, that really helps the kind of implementation and embedding of it, where you're kind of carrying the story that it won't work. And it just does.
Are you looking at sort of how these play out in real time, sort of as people, like you said, sort of look around the circle? Maybe the internal narrative is, there's no way I'm sharing anything. But then they look around the circle and see some maybe senior leaders that are actually sharing some deep, sort of a deep feeling, or indeed a deep reflection from years gone by, which kind of helps maybe that more junior staff see that senior leader in a very different light, and a much more vulnerable light. Could you maybe speak to how important it is for senior leadership adoption of Schwartz Rounds to really sort of level set and the hierarchy and indeed sort of the culture?
Yeah. It's a really interesting phenomenon, because you'll see some organizations who adopt Schwartz Rounds will do it in a kind of grassroots way. So some people kind of on the front line will be like, we need this space, and we'll bring it together and we'll start to get it going. And that, often works, but it requires those individuals to really hold something, and it will be kind of a weight on their shoulders, and they'll be carrying it through, and it requires a lot from them. And then you have organizations where there's immediate like buy-in from senior staff, and that kind of helps to kind of engender that and give permission to it as it kind of goes through the organization, which can be incredibly valuable if it is kind of brought in the way that it is intended. We're kind of increasingly seeing Schwartz Rounds being pulled in as part of some kind of organizational agenda that feels a bit incongruent with the intention. So it also has to kind of have that understanding of the purpose with it. it has a huge impact, I think, having senior leaders be able to say, I don't always know the answer. I don't always get it right. I have made mistakes. I sometimes feel really, really, really rubbish at my job, which is so common and is always the narrative that's being held, but often it's really hard to see. But it can be so powerful to have those two narratives together. So junior and senior staff talking about the same thing from different perspectives. So, for example, we had a Schwartz round once in one of my sites that did a Schwartz round on the emotional impact of staff shortages and the fact that staff were kind of leaving in droves. And the director of finance was on the panel with some of the frontline staff and the head of recruitment, and they just broke down and said, it's been horrible to have to make these decisions, to have to make decisions between what are two horrible outcomes, and for frontline staff to be able to see the humanity of that role, which had always been kind of seen as this incredibly inhumane role, had a huge impact in the way that the organization kind of worked together and saw one another and felt much more connected. And so there was, rather than this kind of internal battle of war within the organization, they suddenly felt much more connected to this shared goal. And again, this kind of thing of stories being able to allow for contradiction and uncertainty, be able to hold the tensions that each role was facing rather than kind of reduce them to this kind of naysayer. So it completely opened up and it kind of gave, allowed for everyone to be seen in that room in their humanity as a person rather than as this thing that they've been caricatured into that was really getting in the way of good. And I think it happens the other way around as well. I really notice it where junior staff kind of are able to role model and give permission to senior staff to be able to start to be open, because there is a relevant difference, isn't it? Like sometimes as an executive staff member, people really don't want to see that you don't know the answers or that you're kind of facing a lot of challenge, that they want to see that you're in control. But I think the issue is that we've collated this sense of kind of feeling in control with, that must mean it's incompatible with any vulnerability, which is not the case. Actually opening and being vulnerable can allow people to see that actually maybe you're in more control than otherwise. So it has a huge impact in flattening hierarchies because of that fact of in sharing stories like this, you see the person behind the professional, and it makes a huge difference.
Okay, that's really powerful, actually, from a number of reasons, really. But like you said, it humanizes leadership, and indeed people that you've so far removed from on the front line, you don't realize care. And I think I can identify with that. Over 20 years I became more, the more I grew in different senior roles, but the more I became more of myself, actually, with both staff and patients, and hopefully in a good way, but very much in a real way, and sort of stop putting on this face and in debriefs and indeed on scenes and in real time with patients, but very much in a professional way, but just trying to be sort of more of an honest reflection of myself, and then hopefully identify with staff in the debrief from from that vulnerable perspective, and didn't always get it right. And there is a real skill to let's say tactical vulnerability, but just honest and open vulnerability at the right times. Could you maybe speak to sort of the progress you've made within the NHS? As Carl says, from his perspective, it's a slow burn. It's going to take time, and really breaking down these institutional barriers and indeed norms that we've not shared at this level before. But actually, Aggie, I completely agree. It's pretty much the missing piece from that emotional relationship, and indeed understanding that people care. And the wider institution cares, because that I feel that's really been missing. Could you maybe speak to your perspective on embedding these rounds? Because Carl very much sees it as a slow burn, and I understand that, and you speak to it as well around it just takes time for culture to change. Could I get your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, that's exactly. I think one of the kind of the points of the really countercultural aspect of Schwartz Rounds is that thing about pace, that we want things to happen so quickly and to get there really quickly, but actually often when that happens, there's steps along the way that have been missed and it's not sustainable. So I feel really strongly and very comfortable with the pace thing, that actually this needs to be slow. This needs to be incremental for it to be meaningful. And again, as I kind of said before, that it's been so many years of very entrenched rejection of emotional vulnerability in this sphere, that to begin to legitimize it isn't going to happen overnight. And as you say, it's, feeling able to do it when you've been told your whole life and for, centuries that it doesn't have any space in this area. It doesn't have a role in this space. That's not going to happen overnight. So I actually I really like leaning into the slow pace of it, because it feels like part of the countercultural element of it. And it's also those kind of multi-levels of slowness, isn't it? Like the Schwartz Rounds itself is supposed to be this place where people slow down, start to move in a different way, start to be able to sit and to breathe. And then so to then expect that the Schwartz Rounds implementation embedding should happen in a really kind of speedy and effective way is so incongruent with that, I think. And I don't want to undermine or invalidate how hard that is for people that are trying to implement Schwartz Rounds, because it can often feel like you're failing, that it's not working, that it's not getting it where it needs to be. But just to kind of invite a kind of acceptance, if that is possible. And again, I'm mindful of different organizational cultures not necessarily allowing for that. To kind of lean into that slow pace, to just have faith that it is working. We know from the evidence that Schwartz Rounds have a cumulative impact. So they need a few of them behind them to start to really kind of work and really start to shift culture and do the thing that they're there to do. But you have to kind of make friends with a different pace to what we're used to in healthcare.
I guess we're coming to land on the conversation, and if this has sort of struck a note in anyone listening or indeed watching this, could you maybe just speak to some take-home messages in regard to starting Schwartz Rounds in an organisation like an ambulance service, just maybe from your anecdotal experience, or indeed from a facilitator perspective, really? Anything you'd like to sort of reinforce?
Yes, I think there's something that feels really helpful about whoever is coming together, whoever's in the Schwartz Rounds steering group who's coming together to try and make this happen, to make it work, to implement it, to sustain it, to embed it, keep it there. There's something about becoming very familiar with and leaning into the organizational narratives. What is our organizational identity? How who are we as an organization? And again, that may be a kind of false narrative, because organizations are, kind of amorphous in a sense, but leaning into those things, because as soon as they become obstacles and barriers to the implementation of Schwartz Rounds, you can actually kind of reframe them as things that can fly into Schwartz Rounds. So, for example, as a steering group, when you're starting to run Schwartz Rounds, and we've kind of done all the kind of training and we've connected and got everything in place, just saying, okay, what are the narratives in our organisation? What are the things that people are really feeling at the moment? And often those things will be things that will feel like real barriers: staff shortages, no space to reflect because we can't even have time to do the work that we know that we need to do here. All these things that will very meaningfully get in the way of creating space for reflection, allowing them to be there, being very open about them being there, and allowing them to give meaning to the Schwartz Rounds rather than to kind of completely like fighting against them all the time, like you're firefighting. So bringing them all into the surface and saying, how can we lean into these and allow them to be there so that actually they give meaning to Schwartz Rounds rather than kind of create blockages to them. So that's always been kind of like a really helpful thing to think about. And again, I think that the really important one feels like that this is still very countercultural. Well, it's that tension of being very countercultural, but also the thing of like, this isn't that deep. Just get people in the room together to share stories and to connect on the emotional impact of their work, and they'll just do it. They'll get it. They'll know it. Even if we think that they won't, they will. So there's that kind of holding that tension of like, this is in equal parts something really big and also something not that deep, that is just people coming together. So to kind of demystify it a little bit and say, yes, while this is countercultural, actually, it's very human and simple. And I think that can help to run something as well when things feel kind of manic and mad in the organisations that we sit within.
Listen, Aggie, that's powerful. Paul, I just want to thank you for your reflections over the past half an hour. And I think what we'll do in the show notes is we'll signpost to the Point of Care Foundation and indeed to the implementation of Schwartz Rounds, just to unpack it further. But I just want to say thank you for your reflections and insight, because they're not only powerful, they're lived experience, and I really resonate with them. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It was lovely to talk to you.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.